Hi, this is Eric White. Today, I'm going to take a deep dive into numbering in Open XML Word Processing ML. Before I start talking about markup and the way numbering is supported in PowerTools for Open XML, I want to define something very carefully. This is something that is defined in the Open XML standard. What I'm defining is a list item, and a list item in Open XML parlance is when you have a numbered list, like right up here where you have 1, 2, 3, the content to the left of the paragraph is the list item. So the list item encompasses the one and the dot and the tab that goes between that one dot and the T in the test paragraph 1. Dropping down here, we see the list item is a 1 closed parenthesis and an A closed parenthesis and so on. This is what a list item is. So now that we've defined that, when I go talking about all the various aspects of word processing ML numbering, and when I refer to a list item, you'll know what I'm referring to. This is the document that we're going to use for our various experiments to examine numbering. We have 3 versions of lists here. First of all, we have a simple list up here numbered 1, 2, 3. Second of all, we have a multi-level list where the first level is 1 closed parenthesis and the second level is lowercase a closed parenthesis and the third level is lowercase Roman numeral I closed parenthesis. The third list is the approach that you can take in Word Processing ML, where you can specify that the heading 1 style has a 1 tab in front of it, and the heading 2 style has a 1.1 tab in the front of it. That these are the list items for heading 1 and heading 2 and so on. Now let's go take a quick look at a little bit of markup so you can get a sense of how the markup is put together. This screencast is not intended to be a complete dissertation into all aspects of markup for Open XML numbering. Instead, I'm going to give you a flavor of what the numbering markup is about and then show you an easier way that you can work with numbering so you don't have to necessarily understand all of the numbering markup. Here I'm examining that numbering test document, and I'm looking at it in the Open XML package editor power tool for Visual Studio 2010. If I expand the Word folder, then we can see the document.xml. This is the main document part. And if we drop down, we can see that there is a numbering part here. This numbering part gives the indication that there is numbering used in this document. If we have a document where there is no numbering used in the entire document, there won't be a numbering part. Now let's open up the main document part. And here we can see the first paragraph has no list item. And the second paragraph, it has this w:"numpr element in the paragraph properties for that paragraph. And this is the key thing that we're going to look at to start. Later on, we're going to look at some different things. So we see here that it has a num ID with a value of 2, and it has an ILVL with a value of 0. The num ID points into the numbering part, and this ILVL, that means that this is a list item that is at no indent. If we get to a 1.1, that's going to have an ILVL of 1, and so on. We'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute, but let's go look at this num ID and see what that means in the numbering part. So this has a num ID of 2. I'll open up the numbering part and format the XML, and I'm going to go to the very bottom of the XML. And what we see here is that there are these elements down at the bottom, these w:"num elements, and these are what are pointed to by that num ID element in the main document part. So the num ID of 2 points to this second w:"num element right here, and it has an abstract num ID with a value of 5. Well, here is a little secret about Open XML Word Processing ML Numbering. What really matters is the abstract NumID. If there are two lists that have different NumIDs and yet they point at the same abstract NumID, they are actually part of the same list. What defines that two separate paragraphs are part of the same list is whether they have the same abstract NumID. So now we've seen that we're interested in this abstract NumID of 5. Let's go up and find that element up at the beginning of the numbering part. I can look for abstract NumID is equal to 5, and here is that element. There's lots of information contained in this element. There's the number format here. This tells us that it's a decimal number format. If we look at the next level down where the ILVL is equal to 1, we can see that the number format is lower letter. And if we drop down to ILVL is equal to 2, we see that the number format is lower Roman. These are all defined in the Open XML standard. We also see this LVL text, and this is a template that you use when coming up with the actual text of the list item. This %1 is replaced by the first ordinal of this particular list item. So I'll talk about ordinals in just a bit. I'm going to show you how you can determine the ordinals for any particular list item. But the simple way to say it is it's the numbers of the list item. If you have a list item that has a value of 1.2.1, then the ordinals are 1 and 2 and 1, to keep it really simple. The representation of those ordinals might be different. For instance, in this particular case, the representation might be a lower letter or it might be a lower Roman, but the ordinals are the actual numbered value that we're interested in. Let's go back and look at our document again. What we can see down here is we have paragraphs that are styled as heading 1 and heading 2, and that they also are in lists. Let's talk about how that markup works. Here I am in the main document part near the bottom of the document where those paragraphs are. And we can see here that this particular paragraph is styled as heading 2, and we see the text of it is more detail. If you'll recall, that's what was in the word processing document at that particular point in the document. And you'll notice that there is no numpr in the paragraph properties for that particular paragraph. Well, this uses a different approach to get the numpr. And what we do is we can go find the numpr in the styles part. This paragraph has the style of heading 2. Open up the styles part, format the XML, and look for heading 2. And when we look in heading 2, sure enough, we can see down here in the paragraph properties that there is a numpr element, and it has the numID of 7 and an ILVL of 1. And that's because we're looking at heading 2. If we go up here and we find heading 1, we see that this heading 1 has the numID of 7, and it doesn't have an ILVL element, and that means that it has an ILVL of 0. That's just how it's defined. The default value is 0. If we drop down to heading 3, then the ILVL will be 2, and so on. So this has numID of 7. So let's go to the numbering part, and we go down to the bottom of the numbering part. We see this numID of 7, and we see that that has an abstract numID of 6. So now we look for an abstract numID of 6. And here it is. We can see the definition of this approach to numbering. We can see here it also has the style of heading 1. This basically points back to the styles part, which is also pointing to this. It's a bidirectional pointer in this particular case. You can see the LVL text, and here the template is just the ordinal, only the ordinal. Below that template, we can also see this element LVLJC, and that's the justification of the list item. That indicates whether the list item itself is right justified or left justified in its little space that is reserved for that list item. You will also find in this W:LVL element the indentation properties of this particular list item, so you can tell how far it is indented and what its hanging indent is. This LVL element here is pretty important when we have a paragraph that is part of a numbered list. Through one approach or another, eventually you retrieve this W:LVL element, and this W:LVL element will tell you a lot of information about that list item. There's a lot of detail that I just mentioned, and we only touched on a little bit of it. There is this article on MSDN that I wrote some time ago working with numbered lists in Open XML WordprocessingML. And this article, it's a pretty long article. It's some number of pages, 30 or 40 pages long. And this article, to be honest, this article really are just my notes on how numbering works. That at one particular point in time, I sat down and worked out exactly how numbering worked in Open XML WordprocessingML, and I knew I would never be able to remember all of that stuff, so I wrote an MSDN article that contains all of that information. It's complex, but as far as I know, it's all here. As part of PowerTools for OpenXML, quite some time ago, I wrote this module, ListItemRetriever. I had to write this module in order to write the HTML converter. If you're going to write an accurate transform of WordProcessingML to HTML, you need to have something that will take all of that meta information about those numbered lists and do the necessary operations to retrieve the list item. In order to use this module, the ListItemRetriever, you need to have 4 modules from PowerTools for OpenXML. You need ptutil.cs, ptopenxmlutil.cs, ptopenxmldocument.cs, and ListItemRetriever.cs. ListItemRetriever has one main method in it, and this main method is such that you hand it an open word processing document and you hand it an X element that contains the paragraph that you're interested in, and it will hand you back, or it will return the string of that list item. Looking at this example program, we can see I open up that numbering test document. This is going to be the same numbering document that I showed you just a minute ago. I then iterate through every paragraph in that document, and I call ListItemRetriever.retrieve list item, passing the open document and passing the paragraph X element, and it returns a string list item. The module itself, it's non-trivial. It's 630 lines of code, and it does all of the necessary stuff of finding out whether this particular paragraph has a numpr element, and if it does, go get the W:"num element out of the numbering part, and then find the abstract number, and then find the LVL element, and so on. If it doesn't have a numpr element in the paragraph properties, then it goes and looks in the styles part. And if the style has a numpr in the paragraph properties, then it follows through with the appropriate algorithm to retrieve the list item. And if I run this program, we see, first of all, the first paragraph, there is no list item, so it returns an empty string. Moving on down, we see the various paragraphs in that document, and we can see the list items for each paragraph: 1.2.3. 1A, I, B, 2, I, and so on. Well, this is all very interesting, but this isn't maybe everything that we want to know about each list item in that document. Let's do something just for the sake of interest. I'm going up to the top of this module, ListItemRetriever, and here is the ListItemRetriever class, and there are these two child classes in the ListItemRetriever class. One is ListItemInfo, and the other is this class LevelNumbers. Right now, these classes are declared as private. I am changing these classes to be public in the next release of PowerTools for Open XML, but for right now, I'm just going to go and make these classes be public so that I can show you what's in these classes, because when you use this ListItemRetriever class, what's in these classes for each one of those paragraphs is really interesting to you. You can use it to write interesting programs that manipulate Open XML word processing ML. Let's change this to public and change this to public. Now I'm going to alter our little example program here a little bit. Let's take a look at it now. So once again, the code iterates through every paragraph and calls retrieve list item for each paragraph and retrieves this string list item. You have to do this in order to use the ListItemInfo class. And the reason why is that when you retrieve the list item, this retrieving of the list item adds an annotation to that paragraph. An annotation is an object that is added as kind of user data to an X element. There are two annotations that are added to every single paragraph that has a list item. One of them is the ListItemInfo class, and we'll look at that. And the second is the LevelNumbers class. And the ListItemInfo has auxiliary information that is interesting about that particular list item, and the LevelNumbers contains those ordinals that I referred to. So dropping down through this class, the first thing it does is it aggregates the paragraph text here for that particular paragraph. It puts a dashed line in between every paragraph. First thing it prints out is the paragraph text. The second thing is it prints out a Boolean indicating whether this is a list item. This Boolean is list item will be true if that particular paragraph actually is part of a numbered list. Next thing that this example program does is it prints out the text of the list item. This is the same thing that we printed out in the previous example. Next thing that it does is it prints out the abstract number ID. This is of interest because, as I mentioned, if two items have the same abstract number ID, it doesn't matter what their num ID is, they are part of the same list. It also writes out the LVL element. The LVL property is this LVL element for the appropriate abstract number ID and for the appropriate ILVL. So it does all the work to figure out which one of these is applicable to that particular paragraph and then puts that in the information that it returns for that particular list item. This example program then retrieves as an annotation the level numbers or the ordinals, and then this little bit of code down here puts together a string that says level numbers and then lists out the ordinals for those level numbers. So let's run this example program. And coming up to the top, we can see that the first paragraph is not a list item. The second paragraph is, we can see the list item is one dot in a tab. The abstract number ID is 5. And here's that W:LVL element that I mentioned. And in that W:LVL element, we can see a few interesting things. First of all, we can see that this particular numbered list starts counting at 1. Most lists do, but there is the option in WordprocessingML to go in and modify this and have it count starting at some number other than 1. We can see the number format. Here is decimal. Here is that LVL text. This is the template that we talked about, and the justification and the indentation. And finally, down here at the bottom, we can see that for that first item, the ordinal is just 1. For the second paragraph in that list, it's 2. Third paragraph is 3. It gets more interesting in the second list because we can see here the ordinals are 1 and 1. There are 2 items in that array of ordinals. And in this next paragraph, there are 3 items in that array of ordinals. There's 1.1.1 and 1.2 and so on. Here's 2.1.1. Let's make a couple of changes real quick. I'll open up that numbering test, and let's make a change here, and I'll change this to this particular format where it's article 1, section 1.01. The third level is open parenthesis A, close parenthesis. Let's click that, and there we can now see that we have changed the styling of that particular list. And let's see what's changed for our example program when we dump out that information. And here's the first item in that list. We can see the level number, in other words, the ordinals is still just 1, but the list item is article I dot. We can see the relationship of that to the LVL text, which has article %1 dot. So the algorithm takes the ordinal, in other words, the 1, it converts it according to this num format value, which is upper Roman, and it converts that to an I, and then it takes that I and inserts it into the template, and then that becomes the list item article I dot. And of course we can do the exact reverse. We can go in here and we can modify this template if we so wanted to, and we could make this be special article %1. And if I save that and open the document in Word, then sure enough, we see that reflected in the numbered list in Word. Well, that's enough to cover in this video. So what I've covered in this video, I've defined very carefully what a list item is. I gave you a taste of what the markup looks like for numbered lists in Open XML WordProcessingML. I showed you the MSDN article that contains a pretty complete definition of exactly how numbering works in Open XML WordProcessingML. Of course, this is basically a synopsis of what you can find in the Open XML standard. That's also a good resource to go and look at. And then finally, I introduced the ListItemRetriever module that is part of PowerTools for Open XML. And you can see how you can write just a little teeny bit of code and actually retrieve a lot of information about all of those list items in a document that has numbered lists. Thanks for watching. See you next time.